Welcome to Preservation Perspectives, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation podcast. I'm your host, Luke Nichter. On March 1, ACHP members unanimously approved a policy statement on burial sites, human remains, and funerary objects. The new policy was adopted in response to unfortunate and traumatic incidents of disturbances of these sites, remains, and objects during Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act reviews. We are pleased to have with us today the chair of the ACHP, Sarah Bronin, and the director of the Office of Native American Affairs, Ira Matt. Welcome, Sarah and Ira. So let's set up a conversation about this. So federal agencies adopt policies that obviously sometimes are very technical in nature. And this is one that can seem that way when you read through it. But it impacts something very personal to us as human beings, namely the respectful treatment of burial sites, human remains, and funerary objects. This, of course, is something we want to address as we work with federal agencies and others on historic preservation. So as I study and I read through these issues, these are the questions that come to mind. And I kind of throw these out to you for comment. So let's start with the basics. Why do we need a policy on the treatment of burial sites, human remains, and funerary objects?
I just wanted to jump in and just say thank you, Luke, for allowing us the opportunity to be on here. And just kind of open this up by reiterating what you had to share. I mean, the fact of the matter is the burial sites, human remains, funerary objects, they're important to all people, right? They have a role in the ongoing lifeways. It's usually unique to the group or the family that ascribes significance. And this isn't information that you can really learn from a book or get through a college class. So the Advisory Council really wanted to prioritize this because there are also not a lot of folks out there that have experience working with these sites, remains, and objects, particularly through a structured federal process, like 36 CFR 800, the Section 106 process. So really, the statement just looks to identify a set of minimum standards that can bring consistency to how people work with these associated communities regarding their ancestors to ensure that they're properly accounted for, but more importantly, that they're really considered in the whole planning process. But I'll defer to the chair.
And, you know, as a relatively new member of the Advisory Council, having just been appointed a couple months ago, I came into this process after it had already started. But looking at the policy was something that we did, actually looking at a policy that we had previously adopted. And this iteration is an update to that policy, which perhaps didn't provide as thorough and as detailed as guidance as, again, before my time, the council and staff and leadership determined was actually helpful in helping people understand the responsibilities that Director Matt described. So, for me, I see that the policy that we had before, which was somewhat outdated and could be modernized, has, through this consultative process, really emerged on the other side as providing clearer guidance, and hopefully will continue to do so for projects for years to come.
That's really interesting. It provides a good segue to my next thought. So you go back a little more than 15 years, and you takes you back to 2007 when the ACHP adopted the original policy. So I guess then today, 2023, why an update, and what does the updated policy do?
Well, Luke, from my perspective, I just want to say, having lived through this, from my tribal perspective, having worked under the various federal legal structures and state structures, the last policy was good. It had its, day in the sun. 2007 was a different era. But one of the things that I think it failed to really convey was a lot of the voices out there from the marginalized communities, Indian tribes, Native Hawaiians, the African American community. Really, it was drafted in a much more narrow lane by archaeologists, an archaeological subcommittee, and it was really with the goal of advancing federal undertakings. So And I think Chair Bronin articulated on this, we did not burn down the prior policy statement. This replaces it. There was a lot of great things in it, but we wanted to build from that. We wanted to update language. We wanted to expand the scope and the application and really build in opportunities to implement it. And I think that was important because so much of that came from that consultative process, from the amount of collaboration and outreach that happened. This wasn't something that just came from advisory council staff. We heard from the folks out there in the field, from the various people who are subject to these undertakings, whose ancestors are impacted, and they called on it as well, that it needs to be updated to, again, reflect this diversity of understanding, but to build in more opportunities for those people who are impacted to convey what it is that's important to them and to influence this federal process, the decision making. So the 2007 was great because it provided us a lot of context and background to build from. There were also some challenges inherent in that because it had set along a path of motion that folks were used to. So we were very tactful when we pursued this update. It didn't happen overnight. It took a lot of time to build through it. And we were fortunate that we got the final few months to have Chair Bronin guide us and help really figuring out a way to apply it and bring it out to the community.
So I'll add to that one of the things that the previous guidance didn't include was really a deep dive and a broader understanding of terms that were used in the prior guidance. And I guess you would say emerging concepts in federal government understanding of indigenous knowledge in particular. So if you look at things in this new policy, like the definition of human remains, which includes cremains and hair and other things that were not fully articulated in the prior policy. If you look at the integration of this term, indigenous knowledge, which we at the Advisory Council have embraced and really tried to promote among our federal agency counterparts, that's something that is new to this policy that wasn't in the old policy, but is emerging again as really a concept, something that federal government actors can and should embrace, that inborn known knowledge by members of tribal communities that people who are not members of those communities don't have, and can in fact inform all of our decision making and how we treat these sites, human remains and objects going forward. So those are just a couple of the details that achieved this, I guess, more modern or more updated approach to the guidance that was already in place.
So in historic preservation, we're often talking about policy or preservation of a historic site or a building or a place. But what interests me here, in a sense, we're all in the people business. And how does this policy affect people?
Well, Luke, when you look at a lot of the principles inside of this policy statement, it reflects what it is that people wanted us to discuss. The core principle in here is really respect. Respect regardless of the scenario or situation. It's one of the ways that we applied this broadly, even beyond the Section 106 process. But we call for disturbance to be a last resort. We emphasize the consultation process and the deference in the decision making to those that are knowledgeable and associated with the remains and the burial sites. As the chair really alluded to, indigenous knowledge is a core theme, that source of expertise and understanding. But we talked a lot about sensitive information and how this should be managed, Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative, education broadly about really the history of the United States and how this has impacted the different people that's associated with these burial sites, the human remains. And we also talked about climate change. That's a big topic that, much like burial sites and human remains, is really something that involves everybody. So we're placing those priorities of the public kind of front and center in this document. And we're working to increase the strength of their voice and the opportunity to not only express it, but to have it incorporated throughout federal decision making. The whole point of this is to respect the ancestors, everybody's ancestors. And it's hard to do so without coordinating with and really deferring to those living relatives or groups. So hopefully we're going to be able to avoid a lot more of these site locations. Whether we run across these and, through a preservation project or it's some sort of inadvertent activity, we want to make sure that first and foremost, these sites are considered to the fullest extent, and that any potential study or disinterment is not inconsistent with how living communities understand those site areas or objects to exist. So we're trying to, for the people, allow them more opportunity to influence the process. And that's also identified through a lot of the implementation that we could touch on there.
It's really important to recognize, too, this extensive consultation process that produced this policy, in which we heard from people, of course, living people who had experienced trauma in a variety of ways because of how government actors, including the federal government and their licensees and permittees, had treated, in particular, human remains in the past. And so when you look at when your question is about the impact on people, this is something that's the topic of this policy is something that's far more salient, relevant, emotional to people who are living today. And we saw that through the consultation process, which is why we recognize explicitly in this policy through statements, again, unanimously adopted by our council, that recognize that there was trauma across a variety of incidences, including, as Director Matt says, through the boarding schools, the Indian boarding schools run by the federal government, and through other federal actions that have taken place before our time, and hopefully never again, with the result, hopefully because of this, in part because of this policy. So the impact on people is wide ranging, but I wanted to be sure that we touched on what we heard during the consultation process, which is that some of those past traumas are still very much felt today, and this is a small step towards trying to, I wouldn't want to say recover from that, but in trying to modestly repair that damage.
I think we've done a good job of covering the past and kind of how we got to this revised policy statement to this point, but then looking at the present day and then moving forward. So the ACHP has obviously has approved this revised policy, but what happens next?
Good question, Luke. What happens next is somewhat happening right now. One of the things that is new to this that came out of the 2023 version that was absent in 2007 was a section about implementation. I think we all know, policy is great. For the advisory council, this is the voice of our leadership. It dictates the actions that our staff are going to take. Through our role to advise the president and Congress, this is what our leadership wants to convey. But if this ends up on a shelf, or most people these days, on some webpage somewhere, and it's not actioned, it's not doing any good. And by building in that implementation section and a policy review period, so that our leadership's coming back every 5 years, looking how it was implemented, and making sure that it still reflects the positions of the agency and that of the people, we're able to make sure that it continues to move along. And a few of the steps that we've started right now is we're drafting language to help advise agencies so that when they have an agreement document under the Section 106 process, there's some template stipulation language that helps them understand ways that they can come in line with this policy statement when they're going about doing their undertaking. We're also developing a companion document. I think you heard a lot in the chair about the fact that this had a huge amount of consultation and coordination. We were not able, all of that influenced the policy statements in this document, but there was so much great information and direction that came from that. We're wrapping a lot of that into additional statements, discussion associated with each policy principle that's going to provide some more understanding and direction. They can help people really understand what it's going to take to implement this. As I noted before, there aren't a lot of people with this sort of awareness or experience And really there shouldn't be, because we do not want to be disturbing these locations or objects. But for where we can, we're going to give them the tools. And those are a couple of our first steps. And down the pipe, we did clearly articulate the need to coordinate with ongoing administration priorities, including the Traditional Cultural Places Revision, Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative, the federal-wide Indigenous Knowledge Guidance document. So we are coordinating through the White House Council on Native American Affairs to make sure that those initiatives and our efforts through this policy statement are really supportive of one another. And at the very least, that we're not inhibiting one another. So we put a lot of effort into that coordination, and we're going to continue it as we move forward.
So then so taking that information and as we disseminate word about the policy change, how can various federal agencies, governments, plural, and as well as other stakeholders who might be involved, utilize this policy going forward?
Well, I think that's a really important question. So the work of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation as a federal agency primarily directly impacts or influences federal agencies and their projects that they may issue permits for or license or fund. So in a way, that universe of projects and organizations, if you consider an agency an organization, is actually fairly limited because, of course, there are private projects that have the potential to influence the kinds of sites that we cover in the policy, local government projects, state government projects. All of these other entities have the potential through their actions to influence negatively the sites that we're trying to protect in our policy. So it's my hope that through this podcast and through other means that we are opening eyes of people outside of our federal process to say that here is an example of the kinds of principles that everybody should adopt in proceeding with the kinds of programs and projects that have the potential to have impacts. And if we can promote a greater understanding through these principles and through this, publicizing what we've done, we hope to influence others to adopt these principles or some version of them in their decision making and how they do things. So again, while we're the federal agency influencing federal actors and federal projects, we hope that anybody out there who is involved with a local government, a state government, or a private firm that does projects with potential impacts to really read this carefully and to consider figuring out how they can adopt these principles into their work.
I think that provides really an excellent summary. Those familiar with our podcast know that we like to wrap things up, providing members of our audience with a kind of call to action, because we have people who want to learn more. How can they get involved? So that's our last question. How can people find out more about this, learn about it, and get engaged?
Well, the policy in full is available on our website, achp.gov/treatment-burial-sites. So if that was too long to write down right away, feel free to rewind and try it again, or just look at our website because you'll be able to find it there. So I think maybe the first step is checking that out, reading through the policy, reading through actually the summary of the comments that we got during consultation to help flesh out the understanding of why we passed this in the first place and to consider its applicability in your community.
Well, unless you have further thoughts, I think we'll leave it right there. So I just want to say thank you once again to Chair Bronin and Director Matt for coming on today and shedding light on this important new policy revision. And to our audience, I would say be sure to follow us, the ACHP, on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube to keep up with the latest in historic preservation news. I'm Luke Nichter. Thank you for joining us on Preservation Perspectives.